Moderator. My name is Jean Morris, and I'm the convener of the working group on narratives of hope and possibility that was established by the Assembly Council at the end of last year. We have had 2 meetings, the first to confirm our terms of reference and meet each other, and the second to begin to unpack the task and begin the work. The work is to explore and recommend to the General Assembly next year through the Assembly Council possible pathways that position the Presbyterian Church in Canada in a posture of openness and possibility for our future mission and ministry. We've been asked to do the work by listening to and telling stories of hope and possibility across the church. What are the narratives? The stories being told about congregations and ministries and presbyteries and general assemblies and national agencies, because we know that the stories we tell shape who we are and give meaning to what we do and why we do it. There are challenging stories that we need to tell and hear, but also ones that show us possibilities, stories that offer hopeful pathways of being followers of Jesus today and tomorrow. Our terms of reference ask us to reflect theologically on the stories that are told in and about the Presbyterian Church in Canada. Where is God in the stories we tell? Where is the Spirit leading? Jesus Christ is at the heart of our story. Another dimension of our work is to explore the experiences of other Christian churches and how narratives of hope and possibility have led them in ministry and mission for such a time as this. And moderator, this leads to the panel discussion today, a time of ecumenical reflection and conversation. The questions that we will ask the members of the panel to respond to are 2. First, theologically, what are the narratives that shape your identity and your faith community's identity? And then, in what ways do those narratives give you hope? Tonight, all of us will be able to respond to these questions as we reflect and imagine the ministry of the Presbyterian Church in Canada as we move toward and beyond our 150th anniversary. So you can be imagining as you listen to the panelists. But just now we have the privilege of hearing how our friends, both within and beyond the PCC, respond to narratives of hope and possibility. It's my pleasure to introduce you to the panelists. Rula Odeh, who addressed the Assembly yesterday, accompanied by her sister. Rula is a Canadian Palestinian of Christian heritage and chairs the board of Canadian Friends of Sabeel. The Reverend Dr. Alan Jorgenson. Alan is the Assistant Dean and the Professor of Systematic Theology at Martin Luther University College in Waterloo, so we're at Alan's house. Alan is an ordained pastor in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada. The Reverend Mary Fontaine, former moderator of the Presbyterian Church in Canada and director of Hummingbird Ministries. Father Bodhan Hladio, who addressed the Assembly this morning. Father Bodhan is an Orthodox priest and former chancellor of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church in Canada. And the Reverend Dr. Pat Dutcher-Walls, moderator of this General Assembly and Professor Emerita of the Vancouver School of Theology. Each panel member has about 10 minutes to respond to the questions that we've posed, and we may have some interaction between panelists. And then following the panel, the Reverend Dr. Richard Topping, a member of the working group, has agreed to provide some closing summary comments and theological reflection. As people of faith, we want to think about who we are in relationship to God. We want to listen for and listen to the ways our stories of hope and possibility reflect God's story of hope and possibility. Friends, we look forward to your comments and participation. Rula, will you begin?
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation to be part of your panel discussion. Is the microphone okay? Okay. So I'm not a theologian, in case the introduction didn't make it clear, so I will absolutely not be using any theological terms. And in fact, I usually have to look those terms up every time I see them because I never remember what they mean. But so what I have to say will be very, very simple, but still grounded in our Palestinian Christian experience, and of course in the Bible and our faith. So one of the things I wanted to share from the Palestinian Christian perspective is, and again, this is with a view to supporting the work of this particular working group, who's looking at listening to other experiences and other denominations to get inspiration, I guess, for how you might proceed moving forward, how you design the future of the Presbyterian Church. So one of the things that I think you'll notice when if you go to Jerusalem, or the old city of Jerusalem in particular, and I know many of you have been, when you go to the old city of Jerusalem, which is where my mother lived in her youth, what struck me when I visited back in '93 is that it's a very small area, and you have these different quarters, and like you have the Christian quarter and the Muslim quarter and the Jewish quarter and the Armenian quarter, and then within each quarter you have like at least 3, 4 other denominations within those particular faiths, and so what we can learn from that is that it's very important to be living in an integrated way amongst other Christian denominations, but also amongst other faiths. And perhaps some of you visited the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. You would know that the keys to open the Holy Sepulchre are actually held by, has been held for hundreds of years by a Muslim family who's viewed as a neutral guardian of the Holy Sepulchre, so that there's no bickering amongst the Christian denominations. So the solution was to give it to the Muslim families of Jerusalem to make sure everybody has equal access. So I find that an interesting story of how faiths can support each other. In the case of, I think I mentioned yesterday in my remarks that my mother's family comes from 25 generations of Greek Orthodox priests. So we have a book that outlines all the, the stories of all these priests, including my grandfather, who was a Greek Orthodox priest. And one of the things that I learned from my mother's side of the family is that the Greek Orthodox traditions, and I'm sure you'll hear more about it shortly with one of our speakers who is Greek Orthodox, it's that there's a lot of rituals, there's a lot of, the Greek Orthodox take comfort in their rituals and in their ceremonies. And I think those can be very powerful, those can be very comforting. And of course, with the indigenous people, they have also the same thing, these beautiful ceremonies that we've seen today. So those can be very comforting, those have a lot of meaning, a lot of power. And I think that the key is to make sure that people understand what they mean, what's represented by all these traditions. And I think it's also a way to pass on these traditions from, to the next generation. Of course, the key is to make sure that the young folks understand the significance of these traditions and you know, what the words mean and what the all the rituals, all the words, what do they actually mean? I know when I came to this General Assembly and I came across the word sederant, and I said, oh my God, I don't know what that is. So I had to look it up. And of course, every single denomination has their specific traditional words, which is great, as long as people understand what they mean and use them appropriately and, you know, celebrate them and use them in the best possible way. That's something from sort of a little bit of the past, a little bit of the background. The other aspect that I wanted to mention from our past is from a Palestinian Christian perspective is we're very rooted in our land. Our culture is very rooted in the land. It's like the indigenous people of Canada. They're very rooted in the land. And so you'll see, for example, on my jacket, we have a lot of floral motifs. In fact, every Palestinian town and village has their own specific motif. And you can tell, if you come across somebody, you can tell from the pattern and the colors and the style, you can automatically tell where they're from. And often it reflects, you know, their rootedness in the land. And so, so this is an example, and I think some of you are familiar with this, the kufi, but I actually only learned this myself recently. But did you know what the patterns mean on this? Over here you have a fishnet, which represents the Mediterranean Sea, and then you have these lines that run across, and those represent the trade routes. The trade routes that of course, you know, in that part of the world, it was in the center of trade routes. So there's a lot of people coming and going through that land, and but to me it also means connection. So the people there were making connections, they were trading, they were learning from each other, and in fact you'll often find people from that part of the world are a mix of different origins. So when I did my 23andMe test there, you figure out where you're from originally. So I was from the Palestinian area, but I also had Greek and you know, probably a little bit of the Balkans, and I even had Scandinavian and Sudanese. So like very small, but it was still there. So you can tell that part of the world has had a lot of people going through and a lot of exchange, a lot of connection. And then the last symbol here is the olive leaves. The olive, as you know, the olive tree is a very important symbol, and it's again part of being rooted in the land. It's a very ancient tree. It lives for hundreds of years, and it provides sustenance. It provides food. It provides oil, and it's an important part of Palestinian culture, the rootedness in the land. So the reason I mention this is because when there are certain theologies that try to take a very literal interpretation of the Bible and try to suggest or justify that Palestinian Christians or Palestinians are sort of secondary, to sort of sum it up, we don't understand that. We don't. The way we understand things is that we're part of the new covenant of Jesus Christ, and anything that is going to call for our destruction or harm us or harm the land, we're not going to view that well. So that's important, and of course, Jesus Christ did come and give us an alternative understanding of what is in the Old Testament and how it relates to him and his teaching. And so one of the references that I would strongly encourage you to read is the Kairos Palestine document, which was actually put out in 2009. And it was a group of Palestinian Christians who came together and offered their narrative as Palestinian Christians. And so for us, we believe, and I'm quoting directly from this, that we believe in God, one God, creator of the universe and of humanity, And we believe in a good and just God who loves each one of his creatures. And we believe that every human being is created in God's image and likeness, and that everyone's dignity is derived from the dignity of the Almighty One. We believe this dignity is one and the same in each and all of us. That means for us here and now in this land in particular, that God created us not so that we might engage in strife and conflict, but that we could come to know and love one another and together build up the land in love and mutual respect. So I think the second question was in relation to also the present. So in the present, I think I described to you yesterday how important it is for us to be steadfast or sumud. And of course, our faith plays a big role in that. I described to you how in Gaza, the church there, it's a small church, the Greek Orthodox Church, and they're in Gaza City. So like that's right in the middle of the Gaza Strip. And despite having been bombed, despite having had the tragedy of 18 people losing their lives in that church, they are still steadfast. They're still celebrating Palm Sunday. Every week they do their services, and you can actually follow them on Facebook. So the faith is really important to, they rely on it. And clearly, although we want international human rights law and human rights and humanitarian law to be applied, until now, we haven't had it done enough. We're also relying on leaders, whether they're church leaders or institutional leaders or leaders in any context. We're relying on them to also use their moral and institutional leadership to help end and get to the root causes of what's happening. But it's not enough just to, deal with it superficially. We have to follow through to the end and make sure that we're getting to that point where everybody is able to benefit as people of God, whether they're Jewish, Muslim, or Christian, and that everybody has the opportunity to thrive in the land. I'll move on now to, one other thing I wanted to mention that the Christian church is doing in the Palestinian Christian church is doing is that they are doing a lot of ecumenical work, and they are doing a lot of interfaith relations work. I know you in the church do that here. Many churches do. That's important, and but at the same time, they do speak up from a Christian faith perspective as well, which they did in the Kairos Palestine document. The other thing that they have been doing is, because the Christians are a very small minority, sometimes they need to give practical and social support. So, for example, one of the programs that was recently offered by Sabeel in Jerusalem was health insurance for the Christian community, because they didn't have access to good health insurance. So sometimes the churches have to go beyond just the regular faith aspect, but go into practical aspects as well. In terms of the future, how am I doing for time? In terms of the future, I would say what gives me hope is that there is a lot of folks who are connecting with the Palestinian Christians. They are going and visiting. They are doing a lot of the ecumenical pilgrimage tours. They are seeing what's happening. They are understanding what's happening. And that way the Palestinian Christians don't feel so isolated. So that connection in our context is very important. I've experienced the Kairos blanket exercise. I was on a panel or a circle at Kairos Canada, and that was very powerful. Sometimes even if you can't go to a place, I think there's ways to sort of simulate what that is like, what the experience of a certain people is like, and that could be a powerful way for people to learn. And in this case, it was inspired by the indigenous experience, but similar experiences such as ours can perhaps use similar approaches to teach and to promote healing and reconciliation. And the last thing that gives me hope is that there is a lot of Christian ecumenical initiatives happening, and that's really promoting a lot of synergy, a lot of unity, alignment, shared resources, shared content, shared calendars, um, how to be bolder, stronger, faster in some of the work and actions that are being done, and then to demonstrate moral leadership on issues such as the issue of human rights for Palestinians. So that gives me a lot of hope, and I'll leave it there for now and look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thank you very much. Alan, thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to come and be with you to talk. Alan Jorgenson, as noted, I'm a principal assistant dean at Martin Luther University College, the exact kitty corner from where we are here at Laurier. Come by and say hi, pop by if you get a chance. Luther is the founding institution from which was born Wilfrid Laurier University and the University of Waterloo. So it's a delight to be with you here today. I'm going to split my talk into talking about stories of Lutherans and stories of Luther. They'll be rather limited, but just to give you a bit of a taste. Stories of Luther, I'm going to use my own story, which in some ways will be replicated by stories of other Lutherans. In some ways will be different, but kind of a starting point. So I was born in Treaty 6 territory to Ken Jorgenson, and my mother was Lakadia Zomer was her name. My dad was born in southern Alberta. My mom was born in what was then Poland. It's now Western Ukraine. So I'm the child of immigrants. In many ways, that's the story of Lutherans. We're immigrants to this land. So I think there's a lot of resonance from other Lutherans and probably from your community as well. It's kind of interesting. Of my 4 grandparents, 2 I knew reasonably well, the other 2 less so, my father's parents. And my grandfather would have known me as a child. He died shortly after I was born. I never knew my grandmother, but for some reason, she's the one whom I have the strongest resonance with. Grandmother in Norwegian, she would be called my farmor, my father's mother. So my farmor is a particularly resilient woman. My grandfather on that side was born to Norwegian immigrants in the US and moved up to Canada. My farmor was born in southern Oslo, or southern Norway, and came to North America through Ellis Island when she was 18. She arrived in North America not speaking a word of English. She came by herself. And the story goes, it's in pieces, but the story goes that she met a gentleman there. They were married, had a child, and then he was killed in an industrial accident. So here she was in the US. She got connected with a wagon train that went north through Utah and up into southern Alberta, and she landed in Wilson Siding, I think it was, and set up the first boarding school or boarding house for renters to come and stay in southern Alberta. Again, I really wish I could have gotten to know her. She's described as a very caring person who is incredibly resilient and determined. She died reasonably, a little bit young from a stroke, but in some ways her story is such a powerful story for me of the power of resilience and the vision of seeing something happen. She met my grandfather. They together had a number of children, 6 children. My father was the second last. And so this story, I think, because it was so powerful to me, was in part a determining factor for me to be a part of a pilgrimage that I was a part of, I don't know, about 15 years ago, 10, 15 years ago in Norway. So we did this walk on the Pilgrim's Way, and all of us had some Scandinavian background. We're over with relatives, long-distant relatives in Norway. All of us were over and over again awestruck by the beauty of Norway. It was such a rich and lovely area. And at one point we asked one of our hosts where we stayed, why did all of these immigrants come to North America in the late 19th, early 20th century? And they told us, well, many of them would have been children of farmers. People had big families, maybe a dozen kids. The oldest son got the farm, and everybody else would go to Oslo or Trondheim or somewhere else to get a job. And at that particular time in the history of Norway and Scandinavia more generally, the economy was in really bad disrepair, and there just wasn't jobs. So this is when all of these posters came from North America about the rich land, imagining that people would have grapevines in the middle of Saskatchewan. And so they came because they had this vision that they were going to have this lovely world, this lovely dream. And many of them, of course, came and had to work very hard. My grandfather was given a piece of property in southern Alberta in Treaty 7 territory. We've since discovered, of course, that the giving of this land was a profound and utter disrespect to people indigenous to the land. And so that's part of the story too. And so I think in some ways for me, I needed to sort of make some reconciliation with this narrative that's a part of my family story. And so for my first sabbatical, I decided to ask the question, what might Christians learn from indigenous spiritualities and worldviews? And so I connected with a friend of mine from high school. I grew up in central Alberta, Ponoka, Trevor Swampy. He was from what was then called Hobima, now called Mesquetsis. And he set me up with some interviews, some elders to speak with people in the community. So I went and spent some time for that sabbatical year, reading some books as well, going to conferences. It was a time of rich learning for me. I'm so grateful for it. I developed a bit of an elevator speech when people ask me what were the learnings from your sabbatical, and I said the three learnings were don't take what's not yours, what's not given to you, don't give what people don't want, and the third lesson was listen. So don't take what's not given to you, don't give what isn't wanted, and listen. In many ways, the Christian church in its colonial iterations, and to some degree in its contemporary iterations as well, has failed miserably on that front, especially when we think about don't take what's not yours. The doctrine of discovery was used to do exactly that. Don't give what isn't wanted. Of course, we've just been through a beautiful moment here in this assembly to think about the pain of residential schools. And then the question of listening. The Christian church has been painfully deficit in that in many ways, I think. And so those are part of the learnings for me as a settler, as an immigrant, as a child of immigrants in North America, as a story of Lutherans, and I think others can relate to that. It's a kind of not necessarily, it doesn't sound much like a story of hope. It's a story that has evoked much lament in my life. But recently I started reading a book by Karen Bray called Grave Attending. And in this, I'm just finished the first chapter. In the first chapter, though, she talks about how lament and hope are so closely related. And so I think a part of the task of being people of hope is to embrace the task of lament. And so I was grateful to be a part of that with you here today. Stories of Luther, I'm going to tell you three short stories, three images, three pictures. The first one is the one probably most of us are famously aware of, this picture of Martin Luther nailing the 95 Theses on the door of the Castle Church in Wittenberg. I've been there. Scholars debate whether that's actually how the theses were distributed. But it's a beautiful and powerful picture. And at the core of it for me, and I think for many Lutherans, is this idea of Luther being convicted by the message of God's unconditional love, and how that can be a source of great hope for us as well. The other picture of Luther that I love so much, discussed less, although among Lutherans it's pretty important, is this image of Luther as a husband and a father. In the Western Catholic tradition, Luther was one of the first priests or ministers or pastors to have a family be a part of his theological wondering and reconciliation and thinking about what it means to be a child of God. There's some beautiful writings about his love for his wife, Katie, whom he made to be the executor of his estate, which was unheard of in that time. So there's kind of a revolution starting in thinking about how do we relate. And his writings about his daughter Magdalena, who died early at 13, are just very heartwarming, touching pictures of how we can be family together. My last image that I'll give you for Luther isn't true, so, but it's an important one. It's a kind of an urban myth before there were urban myths, I guess. There's no evidence that Luther actually said this, but I'll tell you the story, and I think the story is a good story to tell because I think it's true to the spirit of Luther. So the story is that somebody asked Luther once what he would do if he knew the world were to end tomorrow. And Luther's response was, if I were to know the world is going to end tomorrow, I would plant a tree today, an apple tree today. And I think the take home from that is this idea, first of all, that trees are important. But secondly, this idea that we live by the promises of God. So that's at the core of Luther's theology of both redemption and creation, is we live under the vision of a promising God. And that certainly is a reason for hope. Thank you.
Thank you. Kind of get stuck here. Okay, sorry. So thank you for listening, and thank you for what you shared about Indigenous people, both of you. I think my theology has been shaped by my culture, by my parents, by the early missionaries, and by my life experiences. First of all, my mother was a strong Presbyterian, but also very strong in her culture. I would have loved to know my grandpa because she got those teachings from my grandpa, but he died young. I did get the teachings in a roundabout way in this crazy world, and I'm really grateful for that. What I want to acknowledge also is the first missionary to Mistawasis was, I think you might have heard this story before, John Mackay Buffalo Hunter, they called him. The WMS called him that in the little history book that they wrote that I lost. I can't find that book anymore. But when I was at VST studying, I found this little book in the dean's office. And then he was going to give it to me. Thank you, Stephen Ferris. And then I said, no, it's okay. Somebody else might need it, but I regret it that I didn't take it. But it's a book that, well, actually, so what's important to me and what's important to us at Mistawasis is the fact that this man was a friend. He came to Mistawasis, as far as I know, someone said Ireland. Now it's possible that he might have been something else, but I know that it was, he knew our language. He learned our language. He learned Cree. Imagine someone in 1876, in that era, learning a native language and going hunting with the chief. So I think that's a pretty special human angel. And these are the kinds of people that give me hope in my life and have given me hope along the way. I'm not separating my categories, I'm bringing them together. But it's people like him and a grade 1 teacher, grade 2 teacher actually. I say, God has angels everywhere. This teacher came in grade 2, but in grade 1, I went to school, and the grade 1 teacher was a big, mean woman with a loud voice. And she scared me, and I was shy. And when she left, she put me in grade 1B, which was a retarded class. And this, my parents didn't say a word about it. They couldn't. They didn't have the power. I went to day school, not residential school, but day school was just as bad. So I stayed in the grade 1B, they called it, but Mom had already taught me how to read and write. She had learned how to read and write from a missionary who was she couldn't hear. She taught her through sign language. And she was an English woman. She was the sister of Reverend W.W. Moore, I think was the one. Anyway, she came and Mom used to, they lived closest to the mission. And so Mom would go help them work in the mission house. And this woman taught her how to read and write. So she used to teach me how to do the alphabets. And so it must have been a shock to them that I was not only failed in grade 1, but that I was deemed retarded. So we ended up going to, so I go to school the next year, and there's this very kind woman with a gentle voice and reminded me of Mom and Dad in many ways. She's the kind of woman that took us to a field one day and said, look at this field. In this field, there's lots of medicines. Your people know all the medicines in this field. And this was, I don't know what year it would have been, but you know, she's definitely way ahead of her time, and someone who was honoring us in who we were. And there's been angels like that along the way. But what she did also was, one day all the grade 2s were reading, from the grade 2 reader, and she said, today we're going to do something different. If you don't know a word, you're going to help each other. So put up your hand if you know the word. So I started putting up my hand from over the other side, and she ignored me at first, and finally she came over and asked me to read the book. She flipped through the book, and I read it for her. And she said, come and see me after school. So she wrote a note to Mom and Dad that the next day I was in grade 2. So then she continued to be a friend long into my life. And I lost track of her when I moved from Calgary, but I want to find her again because she's a very, very special angel in my life who taught me that I was worthy and taught me that I affirmed that I did have a bit of a brain. And so anyway, there are people like that give me hope along the way. Of course, my mom and dad were the biggest hope I had, and my mushom means grandpa in our language, and he was a pipe carrier. And I also give thanks for my language. My language, it was my first language. I knew that it was my first language until grade 1. I knew language very well. I have lost a lot of it, not being with family now for a while, because the last people that knew our language very well in my family were my sister and my auntie. And when they passed away, there was no one around, Plus I was living in the city, so I didn't have much. But still, the language is very informative, and I really love the fact that so many people are returning their language because there's knowledge in that language. There's a spirit in that language. It's a very gentle spirit in the Cree language, in the Nahiyel language. And there's words in there that are not part of the English language. When I was at VST, they allowed me to take my one course using my Cree language instead of doing Greek or Hebrew, and that was a blessing. I was able to contact my elders, and one of my uncles had given me a Cree syllabics Bible, and it was a very great experience to be able to go through that journey through the language and learn more about it. I did not know my language that well at that time, but it still was inspiring. And I think for those young people that might be listening, if you're learning your language, it's worth it. Just keep it up. A few years ago in 2010, my mushroom passed away. He was a pipe carrier. And I was asked to go and do a funeral at Mr. Wasis, and I was waiting, but it was my mushroom's funeral. So all the elders, I don't know where they came from. I'm from Treaty 6, and that gym was absolutely full of elders who spoke Cree all the way through. They did not speak English. And listening for them for about 4 hours, my heart was dancing because I knew the language was coming back. So I think the language can inform your theology, definitely. And also, knowing the people, what brings you hope, what makes your heart dance. And especially when you discover something and I'm discovering more and more stuff as I'm learning right now. I'm learning from elders. I've been interviewing elders for quite a long time now, not only elders from Canada and North America, but from across the world. Some people I met at VST Summer School, great place to meet people from Australia, sometimes from, where was the other place? Indonesia, I think there was a fella. Anyway, there are people that have informed me about many, many things, and I've learned, and it'll become part of who I am, part of my theology, part of my understanding about who God is. How much time do I have? I'm also, there's a lot more we need to know, I need to know, that I want to know about our teachings. Stuart has been talking about the medicine wheel a lot. I know some things, but I don't know very much. But I've been interested in the teachings of the star blanket. Nobody talks about that. And when I was at VST, I was looking for the teachings of the star blanket. You can't find that on the internet. So everybody said, oh no, it's got to be on there. Nope, they're not. Because the elders kept that to themselves. And unless you want to know it, you know, now they're saying you should know your language to understand it, because some of the words are not the same as English. Some of the concepts are not quite the same. And you can't say it, you can't translate some of the Cree words into English. Learning from our ancestors, learning about like the theology of the land, the theology of of relationships, like I mentioned, the tree, learning from the ancestors, and our ancestors are not just human, as we know. The ancestors, like our trees and all the animals, and were created before we were. Theology of human nature is a big one. Circle teachings, the teachings of balance, and a lot of healing ceremonies are. It's because they know about human nature that they can do that. There's one particular ceremony that I was hoping to find a teacher to come and do a workshop for us at Hummingbird Ministries. And unfortunately, that man died. He was, I think he was from the Navajo people. And he had a ceremony about bringing your mind back to normal, bringing your mind back. It was a very simple ceremony. I saw it once on an internet thing, and then I couldn't find it again. But sometimes you're given this short little teaching, but it stays with you. And those are the blessings of hope that you find along the way. I think that's mostly what I was going to say. Okay, thank you.
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you. A couple of resonances with the Rula's mentioning rootedness in the land. That's there. Professor Jorgenson's mentioning of immigration to Canada, the poor conditions in also Western Ukraine and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which had big families, no land, and so they came to Canada, and the Canadian authorities were happy to, quote unquote, give our people the land. And another aspect of that, which is really interesting for Reverend Mary, is that relationship between those Ukrainian immigrants and the First Peoples here, which we don't have time to talk about, but I have just discovered this in the past few years and find a lot of very edifying interactions there. And I'll come back to trees at the end. As far as the narratives that shape my Ukrainian community, number one is this long and rich history, which you can't separate out the church and the state, the political and the theological in that. We talked about it a little bit this morning, Kiev and Rus. There was a meme when the full-scale invasion came on 2 years ago. There was a meme going around the internet. I don't know if anybody saw, but it was like 4 pictures, one above the other. The top, the first one said, Kiev, 988. And you had a picture of some church somewhere. and in underneath was a picture of a swamp, and it said, Kyiv 988, Moscow 988, and then Kyiv 1015, Saint Sophia Cathedral, and a swamp. Kyiv 1050, and that kind of a thing, because Moscow didn't exist, and a lot of our people, this is something that they grew up with, but that because of Russian imperial and Soviet historiography, everybody thought 988, Vladimir, Russia, and the end. So this was a big thing within the Ukrainian, Orthodox Ukrainian Catholic community. And then we go on. This history going into the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which we mentioned, the education, the high level of education in Ukraine, when in the mid-1630s, the Kyiv and Mohyla Academy was begun. It was the only such higher educational institution within Eastern Orthodoxy. So this is another thing that colors the narrative of our people. Then you have the Russian Empire, and it's a very interesting thing that, Ukraine was treated more or less as a colonial territory, and there were those aspects of its life. But by the same token, as opposed to First Peoples, Native peoples here in Canada, the Ukrainians could, within the empire, whether in the secular sphere or the church sphere, rise not to the top, but almost to the top, because there weren't these issues which, of race, etc., that would not have been on the radar screen at all for the Native peoples here in Canada. Then you have in 1918 to 1921 the independence of the state, the independence of the church, which was subsequently crushed by the takeover of the Bolsheviks, which resulted in 1932-33 the Holodomor, that forced famine that caused between 4 and 7 million people to die of famine in Ukraine. Again, a gigantic thing that was not really talked about too much, even among Ukrainians, until getting into the 70s, the 80s, and then in Ukraine itself, not till after the fall of the Soviet Union, because again, that historiography was of such a type. And of course, you had during World War II, if anybody's read the book Bloodlands by Timothy Snyder, that area between the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea, which is Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic republics, a little bit of Western Russia, a little bit of Eastern Poland, that area suffered more death and destruction than any place else on earth during World War II. So again, that's part of the living memory of people like my mother. And then you had, of course, the Gulag, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that is one very formative narrative. Another formative narrative is the religious colonization. In Russia, you had it with the Russian Orthodox Church, and in Poland, you had it with the Roman Catholic Church, who formed what they now call the Ukrainian Catholic or Byzantine Catholic Church, which was, again, a second-hand church, second-tier church in Poland, and this is in the Polish Republic in the 17th, 18th centuries, which was a means of making the Ukrainians into Poles. Then the religious practice, which grew out of that, and the religious culture, which led into something very interesting, because Ukraine has always been a very multi-faith, multicultural country. The first faiths in Ukraine were Judaism and Islam, on the Black Sea. So Ukraine has always been very multi-faith, and we know from research that where faiths have some type of competition, there tends to be a greater degree of religiosity. People are more religious in places where there are various options, if you want to put it that way. And that's a major difference between Ukraine and Russia, where orthodoxy was imposed and continues to be imposed from above. So you have that aspect of religious tolerance, which again is part of our tradition. You saw the slide about the Ukrainian Council of Churches earlier today. And then finally, from the past, this Western orientation. Historically, that area, which is now seeing the brunt of the war, was just open land. And there was no real contact between Moscow and Kyiv until about the 16th, 17th century, when in Moscow they found out there were these people down there, who also said they came from Rus, right? So Ukraine's orientation was north and west, whereas Russia's orientation was south and east. And you see that even today where, Russia's biggest allies are who? North Korea and Iran. And so this Western orientation is a big part of the narrative, with Ukrainians having historically democratic values. The traditional means of governance was you'd all get together, like in a Swiss canton, you'd all get together and everybody would have a voice. One of the things you hear nowadays very much is Ukraine never started a war, which is true, never had a dictator. And we look at the Maidan, the revolutions that took place in 2005, again 2014, how people are organized just by themselves, anarchy in a good sense. People just get together, organize themselves, and do it. So these are all historical and existent parts of the narrative of Ukrainians. And so for the future, what gives us hope? Number one is we are here, okay? There have been many attempts to eradicate Ukraine as a nation, its culture, its language, its church, but we are here. So point number one. Point number two is resilience. No matter what anyone tried to do, it wasn't snuffed out, the culture, the language, etc. Very much like, the martyrdom in the early church, you kill one and two more Christians shoot up. And you kill two and four more Christians shoot up. So that's another one, is resilience. Number three is self-reliance. Until 1991, all manifestations of Ukrainian state, cultural, and religious life were formed or grew up without any type of Western aid or support. So self-reliance. Number four, this subaltern experience, existing in a state which is not conducive to your prospering, whether in a cultural way, in a religious way, whatever. This experience also has brought much strength to the Ukrainian people in all facets of life. And point number five here is very important, the whole turning upside down of the Tsarist or Soviet historiography. When I was a kid, you'd say, I'm Ukrainian, oh, you're Russian. No, I'm Ukrainian, no, you're Russian. And that was the way it was. And in universities, in the popular culture, everywhere, Ukraine was equated with Russia. And so this historiographical turn has taken place in the past 20 years, and especially in the past 2 years, to really identify the differences between Ukraine and Russia have really gone to support the idea of a Ukrainian identity. And so to finish with a tree, yes, the trees are great. And I have a friend of mine who's a Greek Orthodox monk who likes to say that you have hope, you plant an olive tree. Why? Because the olive tree doesn't give you fruit for at least about 30 years. So you plant that olive tree, you're doing it for your children.
Thank you very much. Pat.
Okay. So no one will be surprised if a Bible professor chooses some narratives from the Bible as the tales that give us identity as the people of God, and then makes the point that many of those tales give us hope to live by. The stories of Abraham and Sarah leaving everything they knew to follow a call from God, or the tales of David as a very human king who was yet remembered as a man of God, or Jesus' healing of a blind man, or Philip baptizing the Ethiopian eunuch. All of these and many more tell us a lot about who we are when we remember these stories as if they are our story. And they give us a sense of hope because they remind us that God is present within human lives when people are in need. But I want to focus on just two narratives today. The first is the story of Elisha and the commander of the Aramean army, Naaman, an able warrior who's led his country to victory over the kingdom of Israel. His greatness is hampered and shamed by the fact that he has leprosy. hearing from a captive Israelite slave girl that there's a prophet back in her home country who can cure him, Naaman secures his king's position and a generous funding sort of for a gift to seek a cure in Israel, the country he's just conquered. Confronting the dismayed Israelite king, who of course is confronting this commander, Naaman is instead summoned to Elisha, the man of God in Samaria. Upon visiting Elisha, he's summarily told to go wash 7 times in the Jordan. This important and powerful man is taken aback and angered by the apparent lack of appropriately grand attention from the prophet in effecting a cure. Only the caution by his own Aramean servants to think before he does this prompts him to actually carry out Elisha's instructions, and he is healed. The second story for my reflection is the Matthew story of the Canaanite woman who pushes back against Jesus to gain healing for her daughter. The tale relates a time when Jesus left Judea and traveled to Tyre, a Phoenician city up the coast. A woman of the area, whom the story emphasizes is a foreigner, seeks his help to cure her daughter. Jesus puts her off, saying that he only came to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. He follows this up with a slur that references an attitude of that the Jews of that day might have had felt about Canaanites, or foreigners, as dogs, a term of contempt. But the woman cleverly and assertively persists, saying that even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table. Now bested in a battle of wits by the woman, Jesus recognizes and proclaims her faith and announces the healing of her daughter. Woman, great is your faith. Let it be done for you as you wish. If we take these two narratives as examples of how the Bible might be a primary source of identity for us as Jesus's followers, where is the hope in these stories? Certainly, these stories remind us that God is present in human lives when human lives are in need, and that can give us a sense of hope that God answers need. As real and important as that hope is, I discover beyond this sort of generic hopefulness God is that might be applicable for concrete situations today. I want to bring those stories home to a contemporary context of my own. I want to illustrate that by taking some wisdom that I see in these stories and relating it to a story from my own context. The story of Trinity Presbyterian Church and our Don't Go Hungry program. Some of you have heard about this. We talked about it last year a little bit at General Assembly. This food security initiative was started by my congregation early in the pandemic to provide groceries to individuals and families who are facing hunger. Each Saturday for 4 years now, we have provided upcycled groceries and provisions from sources such as the Greater Vancouver Food Bank to our neighbors. Starting with just a few church volunteers feeding just a few families 4 years ago, the program has grown to distributing groceries at 5 sites in our area, using over 250 volunteers. This past Saturday, June 2, we reached a new record in the number of people fed. 1,960 people were fed this past Saturday through this program, though we average more like just 1,600 to 1,700 people a week. Both our guests, as we call them, and our volunteers reflect Greater Vancouver's ethnic and cultural diversity, with multiple countries of origin, multiple languages, and ages ranging from infants to elders are fed through this program. Many guests become volunteers, so we are literally neighbors feeding our neighbors. So, now to make the connection. How might ideas from those two biblical stories inspire hope for us as we take on the huge amount of work of this program? A first bit of wisdom from the stories of the Aramean commander and the Canaanite woman reminds me of a current TV commercial, I'm assuming you've seen it, for one of those weight loss medications where people look at the camera and say, "I just asked." How many people have seen that one? I just asked. In both the prophetic narrative and the Jesus story, people in need of healing just asked. Behind the asking was both a desperation for help and an audacious confidence that God would answer. For "Don't Go Hungry," we see the ask in the requests of our neighbors for food and their growing confidence that that church on the corner can help. They don't know the name of our sites. 3 of our 4 sites are at our versions of our church. And they don't know the names, but they know that church on the corner can help. But we also see the ask working in our amazing volunteers who just ask. Lots of people and community organizations, from city government to the Rotary Club to the local craft brewery, to help us get food and money and then supplies like tents and huge refrigerators. Another bit of hope in the concrete from the Elisha and Jesus stories is seen in the intriguing element in both stories that surprising people ask for and receive grace without barriers of cultural expectations typical of the ancient world. In both stories, people outside the expected boundaries find help in God's blessing. An enemy commander who's already an outsider because he's an enemy, and a commander, and then he's a triple outsider because he has leprosy. And then in the New Testament story, a cheeky foreign woman who fights for her daughter's well-being. This parallels the sources of hope that we've seen in Don't Go Hungry. We determined right from the start that this would be a no or low barrier program. If you're hungry, you can have food. At one site, we did have to introduce a simple registration system because it was our biggest site and we were getting overwhelmed. And so that registration just helps us keep track of the number of guests, so we are not overwhelmed with how much, we get the right amount of food for the number of people coming. But other than that, if you ask, you receive food at these sites. A final lesson in concrete hope from the biblical stories suggests that allies pop up in unusual places and unusual people. Both Elisha and Jesus find unexpected recipients and/or allies. Elisha's reputation is touted by a slave girl. And the servants of the army commander call his attention to the fact that Elisha probably told him the right thing. Go bathe in the Jordan and you'll be healed. Jesus himself is confronted with the faith of a foreign woman, and he responds. There are parallels in how that fuels our hope today through Don't Go Hungry. For this program, we learned long ago to park our expectations of who might access our services and particularly who might help in providing our service. Yes, folks from our congregation do amazing hours of work in running the program. But we have volunteers from the soccer clubs of New Westminster, from the Sikh Gurdwara of Surrey, another group from the Sri Lankan Buddhist temple, kids from the local high school doing their community service hours, and folks who just email to say, how can I help? So to wrap up, ancient narratives have provided hope for the folks of Trinity and for our neighbors. In the moments of being almost overwhelmed, it's a huge amount of work. In the moments of being almost overwhelmed, to the determination to keep on asking and build the connections we need, these narratives of hope keep us going as we continue to seek to follow Jesus' ways of compassion.
Moderator, thank you very much. I'm just going to invite Richard to come forward, and as Richard comes, let me take this opportunity to thank each of you for your thoughtful reflections, for the time that you took to be here and to help us begin to think and reflect theologically on stories of hope and possibility. Thank you very, very much.
Unlike our panelists who did such a wonderful job, I've had very little time to prepare. A few things that I found really striking is, well, first of all, the positive appreciation, for the most part, some cautionary notes around tradition and the way a place and a time and a space in the world has shaped you. And it shaped you in particular ways. You talk about culture and space and tradition, and then particular people in the midst of all that, like mothers and friends who paid close attention to who you were and passed on precious things. And it's, as I listen to you all talk, it's made you people of resistance, right? It isn't, passing on a tradition hasn't pacified you. Passing on a tradition has given you a vision for something better than is on the ground at the moment. It's made you restless. And it made me rethink the culture in which we live. Oftentimes, the ways in which we talk about traditions. Oh, you're traditional, like there's something really negative about that altogether. I mean, there's challenges about traditions, to be sure, but the ways in which they deeply shape us, give us visions of the way the world might be. Pat was drawing on the Bible. Others talked about, God and the gospel and the promises of God and the new covenant. All of these things are deeply formative, and it makes you a kind of restless person that, to put it in the language of the Bible, that is looking for the place where the wolf and the lion or the lamb lie down together. It isn't yet, but that disjunction creates creative energy and a drive to move into a world that offers those humane things. There were cautionary notes about tradition, to be sure. Some of the ways in which traditions have formed us need to be reformed. I think there was lots of reference to colonial narratives, but I was appreciating the way some of the things that you were saying about Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. In some ways, you were talking about a re-narrating. That other people tell you who are you. I think that's, similar in Canada. And, who does the land belong to? There's a narrative about that in Israel and Palestine. So this job of re-narrating, of specifying a story deeply informed about how people are precious to God, made in God's image, and rolling out a narrative that is humane and expansive and open to surprise by the stranger who also belongs in that community. I found that really quite wonderful and hopeful. The pieces on hope sort of clustered around, God and the Bible. I was very pleased to see it pressing a little bit on not just any old reading of the Bible, but a kind of disciplined reading, careful attention, because the Bible has, of course, been misused in the service of colonialism. But the hope of connections to God, but also to one's neighbors, the engagement with allies. I heard a lot about that. Outside, I can't read my own writing. Outside the boundaries, the idea of being open to be surprised around who God might draw together things. I think of in some species of reformed political theology, writers will talk about, because Christians have unqualified allegiance to Jesus Christ, they have provisional allegiances to a whole series of human causes, ones that you could sponsor in the name of the gospel. So it kind of gives you a critical approach that not just anything that comes down the pike is worth getting on board with. It needs to be examined in terms of the good news of Jesus Christ. Well, there's so much I enjoyed. I have pages of notes on my table, and if you give me a day, I could make a better response. But those are some of the things that I saw in what you had to say today, and I'm extremely grateful for all that you've done for us. Thank you so much.